Hey everyone, welcome to the Foresight Sanity Preserver. I'm Alison Duckman. I am the incoming president of Foresight Institute, currently a researcher. I am so thrilled to have Robin Hanson here today. Robin, I think, has been with the Institute much longer than I have been, often as a speaker, as a presenter, as a close collaborator. In fact, when I just started working for Foresight, I found that in our archives, Robin, and I think in collaboration with Foresight, has did some future keys, so some predictions on, I guess, biotech risk and a few other risks at a previous Vision Weekend. And back then, people really voted on their future prediction and betted by sending money in checks into our Foresight office. And then I think we somehow figured out the voting. So that was one thing I think that I learned when I just really discovered Foresight. And that was now, I think, well, around 6 years ago. So. And so since then, I think, Robin, there are little topics that you've left untouched with your thinking. And we had the honor to have you on a variety of topics, including elephant in the brain, I think then racing to the bottom or racing to the top in the long-term development for humanity. And so now you're taking on the topic of COVID-19 and especially considering deliberate exposure. You've written a lot about this in the past few weeks, and I'm super happy to have you here. This is quite an actionable topic today, and there's a few action items that people can take away from this, really. So I'm hoping that that we'll get to that a little later. For now, I thank you and I welcome you to today's Sanity Preserver, and I will post your bio and I will post more info on the topic of today in the chat. Thank you so much. It's really nice to see you again, and I can't wait for what you're going to share with us.
As you know, we've got a pandemic, and as you know, it's happening fast. Faster than it looks like a vaccine can come. Obviously, there's still hope for a vaccine, but the usual story is that's, a year and a half at least away, and this is happening faster than that. Now, a lot of people are hoping for suppression. That is, lock down enough, strong enough, and then if you lock it down long enough, you'll reduce the cases enough that you can do massive testing and massive tracing and just squash it for as long as it takes to get a vaccine. And that may well happen, but of course, we're relying on basically the same organizations to implement that have already screwed up so badly so far. So it's a mild hope. I don't think we should put too much hope on it, but we should hope and try. So, but we need a plan B. What happens if suppression doesn't work? If this looks like it's going to go to most everyone, then how do we minimize deaths in that case and harm? So the standard story is flatten the curve. Try to spread out the infections over time so that the medical system isn't too overwhelmed by a whole bunch of people all getting sick at the same time. And that's, of course, the major rationale for lockdowns in the absence of suppression. It's just to spread it out. But if we're willing to consider various things for suppression, we should consider the fact that back, say, in the smallpox was a big bad deal, say in the 1700s, they came up with this solution that people had used in India and China for 1,000 years, which is to infect people with small doses. So, for example, at Valley Forge in the US Revolution, a bunch of troops had just gotten sick in Quebec, which is why they had to retreat, which is why Quebec is not part of the United States now. And then at Valley Forge, George Washington used this new technology he had heard about from his wife, having read about it, which is called variolation, which is infecting people with a small dose of the disease. So instead of the usual 20 to 30% death rate, it was down to 2%, which is why then they were saved at Valley Forge and could go on to win the revolution. So the idea is to try to use that technology. Now, of course, soon after variolation in the 1700s, people invented vaccines, which are of course better, which have an even lower death rate. But since we're not about to get the vaccine, we could do variolation, i.e. it just infects people with low doses of this disease. And plausibly, given 3 other cases that I could find in the literature of other viruses, that would lower death rates from a factor of 3 to 30, which is huge. And apparently, actually, in addition, I've been analyzing the prospect of just infecting people on purpose voluntarily in the absence of this factor of 3 to 30, and I had found that you could get a reduction of 40% in death rates with the simultaneous policy of isolating the old and deliberately infecting the young and isolating them for as long as it takes to get them well, that lowered death rates by a factor of 40 relative to just randomly putting people in isolation if you have them and not deliberately infecting them. So I was already previously excited by that factor of 40% reduction, but here's a factor of 3 to 30. So that seems like it's well worth pursuing. And of course, maybe we're not quite ready to pull the trigger because we aren't desperate enough yet because we haven't done suppression fully or haven't tried suppression fully, but we need to do some things before this is more ready. We need to try it out on small scales. We need to experiment with different ways to do the dosage, what method of infection, i.e. through the skin, mouth, etc., whether you do antivirals at the same time, which might help it even more. And we need to clarify legal permission, who's allowed to do this, set up a way to, a place you would go with permission, medical, personnel, sign the forms, everything is set up before we could be really ready to do this on a massive scale. And my main proposal is to do this voluntarily, that people, when they see this factor of 3 to 30 available, whatever it turns out to be, that is enough to entice them to want to come. And people who are shy about it don't have to come. We don't need everybody to come. But the more people that get this, plausibly, the lower the death rate for them personally and for society as a whole, as herd immunity comes closer via more people being immune. And that's the concept. And that's all I really need to say right up front. I'm sure we'll talk about lots of complications as you bring them up, but we might as well go to your complications rather than me trying to make up what you're about to say. So there we go. So Allison, do you lead a Q&A? Do I look at chat questions? How do you want to do this?
So anyone who has a question, feel free to raise your hand either via the Zoom feature or raise your hand in the screen, and I'll try to get to you. Okay, Ted has a question.
So Robin, it's an interesting idea, and I think one of the things that we would have to overcome for this is now people have gotten so used to vaccines as working with infectious diseases that the idea of going back to this would require quite a bit of education to explain to people about these alternatives and so on. I'm just wondering whether you have some ideas of how to, if you like, gently introduce the idea of going sort of back to the future, so to speak, with the Valley Forge example that you have.
Well, I think as with a lot of discussions about this thing, people are imagining what's the way that we get everybody to do whatever we're going to do. And this is a difference in the sense we don't need everybody to do this. Rather than get everybody on board and then have a policy that makes sure everybody does this, we can just have the people who want to do it. And then the word can spread as they have a happy experience and as data comes on, how well that works for them. So I don't know if we necessarily need to get everybody on board right up front in order to just get it going. We can just get it going. We need enough people to be on board to get permission is the main thing.
Yeah,
we need
I guess
people
permission,
to allow it.
Yeah, yes, I think that's more of the concern than volunteers deciding, oh, I'll want to do this. That it might be prohibited. So that may like sort of the knee-jerk reaction.
Right, and in some sense, we have an over-regulated society where regulations are slow and ponderous to change, and so that's an especial problem in the situation, as we already saw with, of course, testing early on in the CDC. It was the slow and ponderous regulation was a big hindrance, and so that could continue to be true here.
Thanks, David. You're next.
Okay, hey Robin.
Hey, David.
So this question probably won't surprise you coming from me, but my question is, it seems like there's at least some level of risk that some of the people who undergo variolation will, in fact, catch the disease more seriously than would be ideal, and some of them will die. And the blowback from that kind of inevitably, and I think that a number of people have talked about, I think you've talked about this as well, but the blowback from that is that everybody will say this was a horrible idea. And my question is, do you think that there's a plausible case that just because of public opinion, because of the way that people will likely react to this, because we have a much stricter than ideal safety culture nowadays, that could have side effects that would be broader than this in terms of what it is that people would want to regulate, what it is that people would be willing to do in the future?
So I agree that we are a more regulatory safety oriented risk averse society, but we do allow many people to take a lot of risks. For example, apparently going up Everest on average, one person out of 100 dies. And yet not only do we allow people to go up Everest, we celebrate it and make movies about them. And so there are a great many ways in which we allow people to take risks. And of course, let's not forget the last 20 years of military ventures overseas. If you want to think of these volunteers for Variolation as soldiers, I think the analogy is somewhat apt. They're going to be selected for being especially healthy and young and vibrant and vital. They're going to be taking on perhaps a personal risk for the social benefit of the rest of us. And we haven't banned soldiers so far in terms of allowing that. And of course, there's already a related case of people volunteering for vaccine trials. And and I think that's a perfectly valid, reasonable analogy that right now they're trying to get people to volunteer and to be allowed to volunteer to be infected by the virus right after, of course, they've had the vaccine to see if the vaccine works. And that's also a similar sort of, yes, they're taking on a personal risk, but that's for social benefit. We can compensate them, we can celebrate them and honor them. And we need this to help us all. So I think a lot depends on people just actually being scared that this will kill a lot of people. I mean, I do think that in the world where people don't actually think this is going to be a problem, then they would say, well, why should anybody be allowed to take this risk? But once people kind of get it that we are in fact at risk of most people getting this accidentally and suffering much higher death rates, I think people will be more willing to consider letting heroes save us.
Thank you.
All right, now we have a bit of a queue. So I'm going to say John Salvatore, then Mark, then Creon, then Lauren, and Mike. Oh my God, and then Sebastian. I'm going to write this down. Okay, John, you go.
Hi, Robin. So I'm curious who you are most optimistic about taking on or like starting this kind of project. Just because I've been thinking, since I heard about it, I've been thinking about it a little bit, and it's not obvious to me like who would do it. And so I'm curious where you're the most optimistic.
Well, there's two stages here. One is the stage we're at now, where people need to just volunteer to help figure this whole thing out. So at the end of my most recent blog post about this, where I sort of put together a 1,500-word essay to put it all together, I list 10 things you could do, 10 parts of the project you could work on to try to make this work. And so right now I want people to come and join that. And the sort of people I want are people who find this idea plausible and then realize that compared to all the other things you could do to help with this crisis, you have much higher leverage on this because there's much fewer people working on this. And you are one of the rare people who aren't put off overly by it. Like, so a lot of people just look at this and go, if you're not one of those people, you are a rare resource. So jump in and help and take on one of those tasks and go through it. Now, of course, once enough of us do those early tasks to create a first initial trial and to get it approval and happen, then the question is who will volunteer for that. And I think there's just enough people I've already seen online just say, I would do that, I'm scared, etc., that it won't be a problem. It'll be more a problem getting permission to try it. So of course, like one obvious thing, once you go through this process, you're now certified to work and to socialize because you're immune now, right? And a lot of people out there don't want to stay locked down. They want to go back. And of course, a lot of people want employees to work in especially critical industries to be ready, free to go back to work and make contacts with people. So some people will be afraid that they'll be too eager to volunteer in order to gain these benefits. And that'll be the ethical discussion. Should we prevent people from volunteering to help us all through this process because maybe they're poor, or maybe they're stupid, or maybe whatever, but that'll be more the debate is whether to let people do it. And I think once you have a small scale trial, say 100 or even 1,000 people, it won't be that hard to get people to volunteer.
All right, thank you. Then in my list, next one up, I think we had Mark.
Okay, so I like the general idea, but I'm very, very concerned about going through any kind of central decision-making process to get permission, especially now in the US. The US health-oriented decision-making bodies have shown themselves to be incompetent to a degree that I could not have previously imagined, and I was already cynical. So first of all, I want to ask, back in the George Washington days, clearly they were doing this in some low-tech manner. What is the lowest tech manner in which individuals could go about doing this on their own without getting any kind of official buy-in?
So first, just to notice, this is a problem that affects the entire world. So we are not limited by US regulations. We just need to get anywhere in the world to allow it to try it, okay? That lowers the barriers. Secondly, you'll notice on my list of tasks that I give on the blog post, I have two items right next to each other. One is, figure out how to do this with permission. And the other is figure out how to do this without permission, i.e. investigate what would be that sort of task. So both of those should be pursued in parallel. Obviously, the second one isn't needed if the first one succeeds, but if the second one takes too long, then you might want to pull the trigger on the other one to say, we can't seem to get permission, clear permission at least. So in the face of hostility or ambiguity, we are going to just do it some other way. Now, the obvious main things you need are a place where a bunch of people all come together, where they're ready to get infected, where they then do a procedure to get infected, and then where they have planned to stay isolated. So for example, rent a hotel for a month, and have the people who rented the hotel together come and do this procedure and then go through the process, right? So even without permission, you could rent a hotel, and even without permission, you could all show up there, and even without permission, you could have an infected person be there with you and play cards with them. This is a classic.
How do you do the initial infection in a
the cards,
low dose manner?
I was mentioning the cards as a I mean, I've read about experiments where they purposely had people infected with just a cold by having one person play cards with a bunch of other people where they share cards, and that gets the rest of the people colds. Now, that doesn't so much guarantee a low dose. But there's literature here about like different surfaces and how long the virus lasts on different surfaces. So an obvious thing is just to, have a sick person cough or, breathe on a bunch of surfaces, and then vary the size and material of the surfaces and have a pool of people you try to infect with these varying size surfaces. And you're basically looking for, the borderline where a low fraction of them actually get infected. And then you think, well, that's too low. And then you want to move just past that. So a substantial fraction get infected, but then you're at the lowest dose. And so all you need is just a way which people could reliably cough or sneeze, or on surfaces, and then vary the material and size of the surface and how long the surface has been left isolated. And you just need to do some experiments with that in order to find a low dose. But, infection accidentally is not a complicated thing. The more complicated thing is to control the dose.
Yes.
And so, you just want to, of course, this volunteer, you'd want to have measured their viral load at the time, so you could control for that. And you just try, as usual with industry, trying to create a standardized process with standardized procedures and inputs so you can get a standardized output. And it's a simple thing where you just need subjects and do some experiments. So I would think 1,000 is probably enough. 1,000 subjects in a hotel that fits 1,000 people, where you just organize this sort of, different size materials or whatever, then 1,000 data points would be enough to figure out how to get maybe a factor of 3 to 30 lower mortality for everybody else.
Next up, Lauren.
We don't hear you?
Do I unmute myself? Is that how?
Now we hear you.
Okay. So that's my dog. So my question is, if you were to do this, how could you do it rigorously? And then piggyback, it seems to me that if people were to take this risk, that they'd want to get the most out of it. So instead of just renting a hotel and looking at the factor of whether or not you can reduce mortality, it seems like this would also be an opportunity to really study the virus. So you get 1,000 people or less. It seems like to get the kind of science, 1,000 people would be great from a statistical level, but if you could do the rigorous testing, so get the CAT scans, see how their lungs are affected, look at their viral load, study the fever progression, and then also do some of the basic, psychophysics. So I personally had an issue where I had to deal with hypoxia after the wildfires. And so I developed a technique to check my own oxygen saturation through convergence. So looking at something far away and seeing how long it took for me to come in to focus on something closer. So there's a lot of different things that you can see as to how this virus degrades performance and then comes back, and performance on certain types of tasks gets better. So really making this a rigorous study, not only on the virus itself, but how people deal with hypoxia, which would be interesting for space travel, how they deal with viral loads generally, how in a confined environment do people psychologically handle it, which would also be important for the space travel industry. So do this as a rigorous analysis of the virus itself, the physiology of it, the psychology of it, and how knowledge of how something that affects the lungs and creates hypoxia to a different level within people really provides us with a template as to how we could handle hypoxia situations in the future. Also, there's research that this is not just a hypoxia situation, but it also attacks the brainstem. So it sort of suppresses the breathing mechanism. That's just one of many different possible research cues.
So I first started writing about this on February 14th, 6 weeks ago.
Yeah.
6 weeks from now, we'll maybe near the peak of this pandemic. I'm reluctant to try to put too many things into a first version here. So as my colleague Mark Miller knows, in our great mistake of decades ago, it can be a big mistake to try to embed too many desirable features in a first version. You know, I would think, what is the minimum requirement to have a data set such that you could then try to get more people to do this quickly in the first experiment? Once you have lots of people doing it, of course, there's lots of things you can, as long as people are deliberately affecting, of course, that's a research pool that you could use to study a great many things. But the priority now has to be, what is a minimum data set such that you could then go to more people and say, you ought to do this. This is, you know, a good bet. And that doesn't have to be studying every possible way to make it better. It needs to be the minimum concept of a lower dose and what's the mortality associated with the lower dose, and that you can in fact do the other things you're worried about, like keep them isolated, etc. So whatever it is.
Study. You're setting this up as a pilot study to look at one or two different metrics.
You're trying to make something happen here. We're trying for millions of people not to die, basically. That's what's at stake right here. And what's missing is a concrete enough demonstration that people, so you and I might be willing to take abstract arguments and try it. Most people won't. Most people need a concrete demonstration before they'd be willing to try something. So we need that concrete demonstration. And it needs where data was taken, or it was known ahead of time, where you can point to the data and believe it. So you want somebody respectable associated with it, who's in charge of collecting the data, in charge of processing it. So we know it's not just a sales pitch for some pharmaceutical product, whatever. So we need an initial fast, simple, clean thing that gets us that first point of data enough to get people to try.
Just to follow up on that, a lot of times people who are graduate students, so I've seen this with my own human research trials, if a person is very educated about the risk, then you can cut through a lot of the red tape. So in order to get people to volunteer on a human subjects basis, and it's their own project, so they basically have graduate student status or postdoc status, and they know the risks, those are the exact people who might be willing to do a more thorough analysis, and that's a quicker way to get past the red tape, because they're able to sign off
Right.
and know what those are.
What I want to start at this point is just different people breaking out into sub-study groups who focus on different topics and who go through those details, right? So if you want to be part of the group that's like figures out how to create the initial volunteer pool, great, then you can study those issues and the rest of us can focus on, I mean, that's what we need for this to happen, is different people to focus on different parts and to, you know, make separate study groups.
Excellent, excellent.
Right.
Thanks for doing this.
Thank you. Creon, you're next.
Hey, Robin, thanks a lot. Very interesting. So a couple things here. First of all, you know, I've been fascinated by your proposal since I first saw it in February. An interesting thing something that occurs to me, and I'm sure has occurred to you, is that this is not sort of much of a binary thing, like you either do it or you don't. I mean, in some sense, this is naturally happening anyway, right? People are getting infected, whether it's part of a study or not. Some of them are healthy. and it's going to build up immunity that way. So in a sense, if we just had the data, for instance, easily accessible, this experiment is already running. All these people are getting infected, whether it's deliberate or not, kind of doesn't matter from the perspective of the virus or the course of the disease that much. So first of all, I applaud your idea of, just let's get something going, but it seems like in a way something's already going, and we could try and change the numbers. And we can even do, we can do it in the organized way with IRBs and permission, and we can do it in the guerrilla way where people just go and care for people who are sick. People who feel healthy and are willing to be heroes go and care for people who are sick, and then a lot of them get it, and then they self-isolate or whatever. I mean, in a sense, I'm just saying something like this is going to happen, at least from a data standpoint. So I would like your comment on that sort of spectrum of different approaches, and then to sort of just state my second thing up front so that I don't have to come back and follow up. One important issue, of course, is what you were trying to suggest with the cards thing. It is the amount of inoculant that you get, right? And let's remember, I think variolation is a fancy kind of archaic word for inoculation. So obviously we have these situations with the suspected situations with healthcare workers and stuff like this, where the healthy ones still get sick because perhaps they're getting huge loads, which obviously gives the body much less time to mount the adaptive response. So we would probably ideally, of course, want to keep the loads at the minimum possible level if we were deliberately infecting people in this sort of way. Anyway, so wanted to hear your thoughts on those minimum possible levels, if you have any, or what you've learned about that, ways to hack the system to get low doses. I'm sure this is a classic thing. George Washington was thinking the same thing probably. And lastly on that, I just want to throw out this interesting thing. I found this fascinating. A friend of mine who's not a virologist, like almost nobody is around here who's all of a sudden become an armchair virologist in the last month and a half. This guy, though, he did point out that it's kind of, I think, well known. Lauren mentioned brainstem, people have talked about heart, but it turns out the digestive system has a lot of ACE2 receptors in it. And there's evidence that this virus can enter through the digestive system, and there's a great deal of concern about that. But this guy was saying, actually, this might be a great opportunity. He said, we should probably try and deliberately infect people anally, because there are receptors in the rectum and colon, and it doesn't do the damage when you get it that way that it does when it gets into the lungs. The lungs is the perfect environment where it wants to reproduce and where it can produce these cytokine storms and all this kind of stuff. But in the GI tract, if you can get it into the GI tract without getting it into the throat and the lungs first, which would suggest anally, then you can get a minor infection and an immune response, an adaptive response, without endangering the host anywhere near to such a degree. So I just wanted to put that out there. Maybe in your research, you might actually find that someone is seriously talking about that rather than just on Facebook.
So thank you. Certainly one of the variations to consider in initial experiments is the method of infection. Like, what part of the body is it coming in at, right? Is it coming in at a shot, a liquid, et cetera? So you definitely would want to explore those, and rectum is an obvious candidate, and you'd want to consider that in the experiments of the first 1,000 people. You want to vary. As usual, it's more efficient if you can do it systematically to vary several things simultaneously and then collect a data set together rather than having separate experiments to vary each one. But also just on the issue of natural versus unnatural experiments, the idea of an experiment is a powerful thing, and we've understood for many centuries. And even though the world has natural variation, controlled experiments just have a substantial advantage over natural experiments in a wide range of contexts, not just in social science and medicine, but in physics and a wide range of other places. It just often helps to systematically control variation, especially be able to control the source of the variation, say, to know that it's random, so you can exclude some other hypotheses about the source of variation. And that's the sort of thing I would think you'd want to do here. Yes, of course, in the wild, people will get infected. They will get infected with varying doses, and they will get infected with varying degrees of isolation, but we're not collecting data very well on that. And so if we create a systematic hotel or place where all this data was systematically collected together, and that was part of the agreement in setting it up, then we could have data we could convince the world more with, whereas it's actually much harder to convince the world. I mean, so for example, many people rely on this Diamond Princess cruise ship as data about infectiousness, because there we could, there was more control over the number of people and who were potentially infected. Whereas we have a lot of data in a lot of countries about number of cases and number of dead, and everybody argues about the selection effects there, about what the actual death rate is, because who knows how many cases aren't being caught, et cetera. Whereas for the Diamond Princess, a lot of those uncertainties are cut out because the whole cruise ship was isolated together. And that's the kind of thing you'd like to do here, is have a nice clean data set where you could be more convincing to the world.
Really quickly, I don't know what's happening with the effective altruism hotel in the UK, but maybe you could convince folks in there to isolate and do it.
Maybe once you have the rest of the, I mean, we're not ready yet for that, but yeah, that's a fine candidate.
The altruists really are.
Yeah, all right. So, okay, next one up after Quian was Mike, and then we have Sebastian. And if you want to ask a question afterwards, feel free to raise your hand or say in the chat, then I'm going to cue you in.
Okay, yep. I was curious because already it must be pretty tiny doses that are leading to contagion if it's this contagious. So when you say a very small dose, like what size are you talking about? How it could be smaller than what is already being transmission?
So one of the studies that I'm relying on is a study of measles, children who caught measles in an African village. And what happened was they compared the first child in a family to catch measles to the other children in the same family who caught measles from presumably that first child. And then the idea is, if you didn't catch it in the family, you probably caught it at the market touching a pole or door handle or something in a larger sort of context, and you would have gotten a low dose. Whereas if you caught it in the family, you might have kissed them, you might have hugged them, you might have, slept next to them, and presumably got a larger dose. And in that case, it was a factor of 14 in the mortality rates between the first in the family and the others. And another case was SARS. This was a factor of 3, where there was a person in an apartment complex in Hong Kong, and then they just looked spatially at who was physically farther away. This person was breathing and the air was going on the air. People were catching it from that spatial distance. It was a factor of 3 from people who caught it farther away from people who caught it closer. So there are substantial variations in who gets infected with viruses, and this is well known in a lot of other literatures. And one of the concerns you should have about lockdown is that we are now inducing more high load, high dose infections, because we're putting people together, and now they're most likely to get it from somebody who they have a close contact with. If you were just getting it by touching the door handle at the grocery store, you would probably be getting a lower dose, or somebody in the same airplane or train as you were in, again, that's going to be a lower dose than if you're kissing, say, your loved one. And so we can just see there are huge variations in dose, even in nature, just in people getting infected, which that's a lower bound on the effect we can get if we really search for the lowest possible dose that would work.
Right, there was a follow-up on this question by Mike. Oh no, by David. David, you had a follow-up on Mike's question?
Yeah, on this one, the complex with SARS. My understanding is that there's a little bit of a disagreement in terms of what it is that means. So there's a difference between viral dose and viral load. And all the studies seem to show that viral load, meaning how much virus is in somebody's system, is important in terms of figuring out how sick they get. And it seems much less clear that what they were measuring was related to viral dose, which is how much they're exposed to initially. Is there any clearer indication for this, that that's what's happening?
Well, the main problem is that we can measure viral load, but when we have a patient in front of us, and then that's a measurable thing, and so there's lots of data on that. So there's lots of data on viral load relating to things, because it's easy to measure load. To measure dose, you have to be measuring these contexts, which are much rarer and sort of show up in the world, right? So first in the family versus others in the family, or how far away you were from an infected person and who was the first infected in an area. Those are harder to measure things, and so there's just less data on that. But it still seems relative. I mean, experts are relatively confident about this. For example, this is a standard reason for wearing a mask. That is, people say wear a mask not just because you would lower the chance of being infected, but if you are infected, it'll be a smaller load. And this is well accepted standard justification. So the data, I mean, if you want to be skeptical, you can say the data doesn't prove it really solidly, but experts are pretty consistent in believing that the initial load matters. Initial dose matters.
Regarding masks, there is a lot of discussion about whether there's any utility at all in reducing viral dose, which is why World Health Organization still seems not to be, and they're doing lots of dumb things, but it does seem to be part of the justification for not doing it is they don't think that viral dose matters. They just think that the only reason you'd wear it is to prevent people who are asymptomatic or already sick from transmitting it to other people.
So clearly at this point, we face a crisis and we have to act on whatever information we have. So I'm searching for direct data relating initial dose and mortality, and I found 3 things with factors rating from 3 to 30. Now, it would be great to have another dozen studies, and maybe they're even out there, somebody can go search for them. But at the moment, in the absence of more studies, we kind of have to go with the ones we have, and that's what it looks like a really huge fact. I mean, you'd be willing to do a lot more here for just a 50% reduction of mortality.
Yeah,
So this is really tempting. And of course, the way to find out is to actually do the experiment with 1,000 people actually trying different doses. The payoff here is so huge that if you're willing to do that, even if there was only a 10% chance that would work, that would still be well worth trying. And it certainly looks like more than a 10% chance that dose will matter a lot.
All right, so we have next one up, we have Sebastian. I just want to cue NeuroNerd 2.0 and BD as people asking questions. And then Ashley Meyer just offered to help write up a lay audience-friendly summary of those studies, if you want that. So you have another volunteer.
Everybody help on everything. Don't ask for my permission, just go help.
Don't ask for permission. There's one thing to take away from this. Okay, cool. Next one up, we have Sebastian.
Hey, so I wonder if you can speculate about the effectiveness of this treatment in today's globalized society. So, you know, when this was used, you know, for previous epidemics before we had the vaccines, you know, the world was very different and people didn't travel as much, and there wasn't like this risk of transmission through this like a massive movement of people. Is this something that could be effective sort of locally, do you think, even if borders remain open, or would a country need, or like a municipality or a region need to really break itself from the rest of the world in order for this to work? Have you given any thought about that?
So if we were just recommending that people got infected, but not isolating them upon infection, then we would be worrying about speeding up the whole pandemic and making it spread faster and making this peak worse instead of flattening the curve. That's what would happen. We're just infecting more people without changing their degree of isolation. It might still be a good idea, but it seems a stronger, clearer argument to say it would be better to deliberately infect people and then simultaneously isolate those people until they've recovered. If you do that, you're not worried so much about there being in a highly connected society with lots of travel and interdependence, because you're not changing the speed of the overall pandemic. In fact, you're reducing the number of candidates to be infected by making these people immune. So the general benefit for other people is positive if you infect them and isolate them so that afterwards they are then immune. Everybody else now has fewer people to catch it from and fewer people to infect. So I just don't think the overall interconnected society stuff matters that much once you consider the scenario of, voluntary infection plus immediate and sufficient isolation until they recover.
Okay, so effectively you're sort of creating like a scarcity around the number of people that can get infected.
So you don't let people out of this hotel until they pass the immunity test that they've recovered and they're immune. Otherwise, they stay in the hotel. Yeah,
cool. I mean, I guess it's going to be an interesting experiment to do with. So, for instance, here in France, the government has repatriated a bunch of people from China, for instance, in several waves, and these people were locked down in these sort of vacation, vacation communes or whatever. And these people were together, and they were taking the infected people and taking them out. It could have been an interesting experiment to try this here, because these people were already confined anyway and mingling. I also have some other anecdotal evidence from actually one of our team members at Epicenter who lives in Bali and just got repatriated back to Australia. Now they have a very different approach where they've put all these people in a hotel for 2 weeks, but people are not allowed to leave their rooms with the risk of a $10,000 fine if they actually just leave the rooms. So in that scenario, I think that you wouldn't be able to do something like this. But like in a more like repatriation scenario where everybody's sort of in a compound, isolated and mingling and meeting and this sort of thing, you probably use that as a test bed for experimentation.
So I just want to be clear. A close colleague, Tyler Cowan, on Twitter a few hours ago said that my proposal doesn't work because if people accept the proposal, they will in fact just think it means expose everybody to everything without anything else as it. And therefore, in his mind, because people can't make that distinction, this is a bad proposal because it just is translated in people's minds as infect everybody fast. So I want to go overboard in saying, please distinguish this particular proposal from anything that feels similar in the sense of more people getting infected and more people being near each other, because I don't want that confusion. I want this label to be about the case of low dose deliberate infection and immediate isolation until recovery. That's the proposal, not other things that kind of feel like it.
All right, cool. Then we have, I think NeuroNerd can't ask his question right now, so I'm going to ask it. Have you looked into the literature on SARS and COVID-2 and antibody-dependent enhancement?
No, and that's not something I expect to look into soon. And if you think it's relevant, please go look into it and tell us if it is relevant and tell us how that helps. I mean, there's just a lot of things to look at. I, by myself, can't do all this. I'm an economist, and I'm going to focus on the things that economists can do best. The medical stuff, I need somebody else to look into. Okay,
first of all, most don't ask for permission. Next one up, we have BD, and I think, is this Brenda with a question?
Yes, it is. Can you hear me? Thank you, Alison. Lovely. Robin, I apologize in advance. I had to join your call late, so you may have already covered this in the beginning, but I have 3 quick questions for you.
3 quick? I don't think that works.
In terms of positioning. And I was just wondering, in terms of positioning your proposal, is it possible to position this for, say, the second wave or new strains of COVID-19 coming up, so that you have a little bit more time to prepare and get people on board with your proposal? And the reason I say that is, the metaphor one could use is, say, TSA screening or something like that. Before you go back to work, what are the procedures you need to make sure you cover before you are eligible to not infect others? The second question is, and I'm sure you've already done this, is hold expert, a bunch of expert interviews with pulmonologists, people who are working with chronic, heart condition patients, registered nurses, and researchers. Would it be possible to talk to them and say, look, we're putting together this this is a scrappy and, we want to have a scrappy but very thoughtful response. What would you say are the barriers and opportunities in this space to do these types of experiments? And thirdly, is it possible to partner with teams that are already testing experimental antivirals? Related to that, ask them about tackling risks. So if you're testing, say, 1,000 people and 1 to 3 people actually get acutely ill and almost, they almost die, or if one person dies, what do you do in those scenarios? So I'm going to throw all those out there. Feel free to respond to any of them. Thank you.
So their second 2, or questions 2 and 3, or topics 2 and 3, were about partnering and help and interacting with and coordinating with other experts who are doing related things. I think we should just be completely opportunistic about that. Yes, of course, the more we can get anybody to pay attention and react and give us suggestions, the better. And certainly if anybody would be willing to partner, especially if they have some sort of prestige or infrastructure that's already set up, that would be great. But it's a trade-off between searching for partners and assistance and getting something done. And so if you can quickly, easily get partners and help, great, do it. But you know, I've spent 6 weeks struggling to get much of anybody to pay much of any attention. I still really haven't gotten any sort of official medical opinion expressed on it. And so if you can be more successful, great. In terms of, you know, for waiting for a second wave, I mean, obviously if we fail to help the first wave, we have to help later. And of course, in some sense, this is all a big prelude trial for the bigger pandemic that will come likely, you know, possibly in a few years, which will be even more important to deal with. So we want to get ready now in how to set up procedures to do an even bigger, more important pandemic that comes later. But again, if we could be more helpful now, I think that would make a better demonstration and a more vivid example and anecdote that people would point to than if we just have papers and arguments. So I'd like to get as soon as possible to a concrete demonstration because that's what most people listen to.
All right, thank you so much. Creon has his hand up.
Uh-oh, now I have to remember what I was going to say. Come back to me again. I have to think about it again, sorry.
All right, are there any other questions?
So I can see in the chat window, David says, you know, this is proposing a randomized controlled trial, not self-initiated measures. I mean, I think we have to be opportunistic about how to frame it. So apparently, often random trials are held to higher ethical and selection standards than just people doing stuff. So if the official IRBs, et cetera, disapprove of this according to their higher ethical standards, then maybe we do it by not calling it that and saying these are people who are feeling desperate and want to do something and this is what they're going to do.
I think you still would want to even if you don't get IRB approval, you still want to first call it an RCT very clearly so that you differentiate from people just going off and doing dumb things. And also to the extent possible, you know, go by standards for RCTs, define your endpoints, like do all of the things you're supposed to do that way so that you...
I'm happy to try to do as careful a job as we can, but like, so for example, I do Twitter polls sometimes, but I don't have to get IRBs for my Twitter polls. And then people say that's scientifically meaningless. It has absolutely no information value because it wasn't an approved randomized poll, of course. Of course, that's not entirely true. It might be more valuable to be a full national sample poll, but Twitter polls are of some value. But if you pretend you're not doing science, you can get away with doing more things fast. So yes, do all the right science things as carefully as you can, but whether to call it science or not is a strategic question about whether you'll get permission or not.
I'll just say the only reason that it's not an IRB problem to run Twitter polls is because you haven't asked an IRB. I'm sure they could tell you that it's...
Yes, well, again, let's not ask if we don't think we'll get the right answer.
All right, Creon remembers his question.
Yeah.
Is that
okay,
correct?
So this isn't really a question, but it's a discussion topic, which I'd love to hear Robin his feedback because he knows the economics, but anyone's really. So it's at least within the realm of theoretical possibility that one could incentivize this. For instance, in one of these hero hotels or whatever you're calling them, presumably you would be attracting ideally young, healthy people or the people in the cohorts with the lowest risk of damage. But on the other hand, if those people do get a bad case, they get, you know, and die, they lose the most quality adjusted life years. So you could incentivize and say, hey, check into the hotel and you're guaranteed top of the queue, best medical care if you get complications. Because you're going to get it anyway.
Sure.
So, you know, there's an incentive.
Actually, so let's imagine that we are delayed and we finally get ready to do this and it's near the pandemic peak. We are at the point where medical resources are extremely stretched thin, right? At that point, people might say, well, this is irresponsible for you to create more medical demand now because we're already stretched so thin. You should do this at some other time. So a counter argument could be, well, look, if we just lower this by a factor of 3, we're replacing 3 random patients in the next few weeks with 1 patient now. And that could be lowering the demand over the next few weeks because of the fact that we're getting this lower rate of death and complications and illness. And in addition, one way to tempt people in, if you could get permission, not only is that they get priority medical treatment, but maybe a family member. So go for the hero part.
How do you
they've got a loved one who they are afraid is going to die in the next few weeks, and they come in order to get their loved one priority.
Sure, there's no end to the number of incentives one could try and pile on if it was deemed appropriate, but you keep bandying about this 3 to 30 factor or something like that. Could you go into that a little more detail? I especially don't understand it in your last example, how if you peaked, then how is it that deliberately infecting a few people is going to reduce it by 3 to 30 if half the people have already gotten it or the peak has already gotten it?
So we're talking about a death rate factor that is in these three empirical studies I saw, the range is a factor of 3 to 30 in the death rate, which also tends to correlate very consistently with severe symptoms and mild symptoms, et cetera. So basically, if there is this factor of 3 to 30 in the death rate, it's also a factor of 3 to 30 in severe symptom rate, also a factor of 3 to 30 in mild symptom rate. Then
what's the mechanism for the reduction?
That's the whole viral load thing. That is initially, when you first get an infection, your body goes, ooh, there's an infection, and your immune system tries to grow fast, and the virus tries to grow fast, and then you've got a competition, and they're growing, who can grow big fastest. So the smaller the initial dose, the bigger a advantage your immune system has in that contest, and that's why you have fewer symptoms, fewer severe symptoms, fewer death if you have an initial low dose.
It relies on this being true for this virus, which we suspect.
Yes, which we strongly suspect.
And it relies on a reliable way for us to figure out how to do just an inoculatory dose rather than a
right. We have to figure out how to reliably give a low dose, but we know how to reliably give a dose. We just have to experiment with how to give a low dose. And again, if people having a low dose have lower demand, then even at the peak, you're replacing again 3 people who are going to need care over the next few weeks as everybody gets infected with 1 person who needs care now. That's only with factor 3.
I'll be quiet after this, but it makes me wonder if there's any possible forensic way post facto to determine what someone's initial dose was with reliability.
No, not other than other symptoms.
So I think one problem with, for example, having a doctor provide like improved medical care for someone checking into such a hotel, and then arguing that, they would be exposing less people. So on the long run, it would be better, is that, that's usually not how the media works, or like, that's usually not how like most people's minds work, right? They compare the sick person right now to a healthy person right now, without really having that, I think that future outlook. So even if you were arguing, okay, actually we're saving QALYs or whatever, according to that prioritarian view, you're comparing people right now. So is there a way in which you could kickstart this now so that you don't get into kind of like into this like, is there a way in which we can frame it in a way where you don't have to compare sick people to healthy people?
Framing is definitely one of the tasks I should list on my list of tasks. Oh, I did list on my list of tasks, and I am famously not good at. I have badly framed many things in my lifetime, apparently. So don't look to me for framing advice. Look to me for what to do advice. But remember that in the 1700s, people hated this idea of deliberate infection, variolation. They thought this was, for the same reasons people today would be repelled by it, people then even more. There was even more concerns, of course, because they were much less scientifically literate, trained society, and yet it became the regular standard thing. So that happened then. Can't we be as good?
All right, maybe we can look to Kiran for framing. I liked his suggestion of a hero hotel. That's a nice framing. I don't know, I thought it came from Kiran, but okay. Next one, we had up Mark. And this may be the final question because we're at 10 a.m. for me.
Yeah, so Robin, you said one thing that I didn't understand, which was you referred to in 2 years a pandemic wave that would be very bad.
I didn't mean to say two. No, I didn't think I said that.
Okay, in that case, good. Because
so as you know, the scenarios are: 1, this just gets really bad in the next month or 2, and we see the peak in the next 2 months. That's actually a pretty likely scenario. Okay. Another scenario is we manage to suppress but not very well. And so we slow down the growth, and in some places slow it down enough, but in other places not, so that this, over the next 6 months, you're seeing various places at various times hitting their peak.
Okay, I just misheard something. Everything else you said makes sense. So,
Robin, this whole is another topic I know, but since you're an economist, I'm really interested in your take on this briefly. The whole slow down the peak thing. I mean, at some level, it doesn't matter. Some might say, in fact, that even if you offload the medical system by having it be less overwhelmed, you prolong the shutdown, and more people suffer from that. What are your thoughts on that?
So I'll point to 3 important considerations. One is that shutting down the economy is a substantial cost, as you note. 2 is that, of course, spreading out the demand for the medical system is an advantage, but that's bounded by how much the medical system helps, and it might not help as much as people think. So, for example, everybody's very obsessed with ventilators. And from the data I linked to or cited in my paper, in China, 86% of people on ventilators died, which bounds the benefit they could be getting by less than 14% by being on a ventilator. That's only if 100% of them would have died without it. So that means ventilators are a good thing, but only that 14% good thing, not the factor of 3 to 30 we're talking about. And the third factor here is that by isolating people with a lockdown, you are increasing death rates because they're getting higher doses. And that's the thing I don't see in most of the public discussion about lockdowns. I hear in public discussion, we're going to save lives by medical demand versus we're trashing the economy. And then everybody's irate. You care about economics more than lives. But of course, a crashed economy also hurts lives. But there's the third factor of this huge increase in death rates we may be causing by giving people higher doses.
Man, that reminds me so much of the problem with diabetes and dialysis versus preventative care. You know, it's yeah, but again, it's framing, I think. All right. So one thing that I want to ask you, maybe to close out, is, and I know, you know, there's a ton more questions, but we have to stop. One thing is, you mentioned don't ask permission, spread out into different research groups. We already had maybe a few people volunteering to do that. What are specific ways? What kind of groups, or well, not research, but what kind of like volunteer groups would you like? Kind of like as an action item to see.
My blog is Overcoming Bias. My latest post was my essay on this topic. It ends with a list of 10 tasks. So those are the tasks that I think people should take on and try to work on. And of course, coordinate with others on. And you know, if it would be good to create a place where people could sign up to tasks and make a working group where they talk to each other, then we can certainly do that. But I don't want to prematurely do that and have it sit there and look silly because nobody, it's empty.
All right, well, so then how about this? I already posted the post in there. I'm gonna, on the Sanity schedule, post it again so that people have it in a more kind of like permanent way. And then I would just ask people that, you know, if you're interested in doing this and you cannot reach Robin, reach me. I will try to get some funneling going. And if you're interested in setting something up, and Robin is time constrained, then feel free to go through me for now, and then I'll try to get something together. But in any case, Robin, if we can help in the future, you know, if more efforts, or like you've updated your thinking on this, please let me know. I'd love to have you on again. For now,
well, I have, as you know, a great many other topics I'd be happy to talk about. This is just what I've been jumped onto in the last few months because this is a crisis.
You know, I would love to do it. Yesterday we had Anders Sandberg here for an Ask Me Anything, and that was really good too. So maybe we could do one of those in the future, and then people can kind of like, you know, wiggle around your various incountable topics that you think of. I saw, I think, just earlier.
I'd love to talk about vouchers for crime.
Okay, great. Vouchers for crime. We also had Sebastian kind of like hold up the book Elephant in the Brain, and I'm sure there's a lot of topics. So for now, thank you so much for taking time. I'm gonna
thank you all for coming.
The relevant info in the show notes, and we're gonna stop the recording now. And I hope you have a lovely day. I see many of you tonight for Creon's talk at 6 p.m. PT, and that's on potential positives or potential upsides from COVID-19. Yeah, I think he will probably do a little bit of a walkthrough as well on a few things that were discussed on the salon. I'm super excited. I welcome you all to join it. If you are interested in kind of staying up to date on Foresight's work, I'm quickly going to post our mailing list. That should give you, if there's one thing that you should sign up to, then it's maybe that, because we're going to post updates on a lot of other things on that mailing list. And for now, thank you so much, Robin. I'm hoping this, and we can get some permissionless volunteerism around this. All right. Bye-bye, everyone. Have a lovely day.